All set.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Hardy. I'm the Program Director for Planning and Performance Management here at ASHA. Welcome to Webinar 17 in our ongoing Transportation Asset Management webinar series that's being sponsored both by FHWA and ASHTO. The topic of today's webinar is Transportation Asset Management and Risk Management. It's a webinar that builds upon a workshop and peer exchange that was held back in late August in St. Paul or Minneapolis, the Twin Cities area, where we had spent about 3 days talking about enterprise risk management and sort of risk management in general and how it relates to asset management. So I think today's topic is going to be very, very timely. The ongoing webinar series, we have presented these webinars in the series sort of every 2 months going back to 2012 on a variety of topics related to asset management. We do record all these webinars, so if you do want to see or listen or download presentations, material from any of the previous webinars, you can visit tam.transportation.org. That's the ASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management website, along with the general sort of TAM information portal. From there, you can click on TAM events in the main menu. You can download, you can sort of view other webinars. You can also register for any of the upcoming webinars. So a good archive of lots of webinars that have taken place over the past almost 2 to 3 years. So as I said, the tam.transportation.org website, it's the new home for the ASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management. And if you want to find out more specifically about the subcommittee, when you go to that website, click on the Subcommittee on Asset Management under the About menu. That's in the sort of the top right-hand corner. There you can see current membership, current leadership, all that sort of stuff. So if you have any suggestions on future webinar topics or you have any questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please submit them via the webinar's Q&A feature. Don't raise your hand. We're not going to take questions via audio just because it gets a little too cumbersome, but there is a great little Q&A feature that you can type in your questions, and we have an archive of those questions, and if for some reason we can't answer them for you today, we can always get back with you. And hopefully there'll be a lot of robust questions and sort of discussion from the panelists about it, but if we time, we only have 90 minutes for this, so we can always sort of take questions and everything offline via email. I do want to mention 2 other things. There is a asset management pooled fund project ongoing sponsored by Iowa DOT, which is sort of connected to the ongoing National Transportation Asset Management Conferences that TRB hosts and that ASHTO is always a sponsor of. If you're a state DOT or if you're an NPO or a transit agency, anybody can contribute or be a participant in the pooled fund. For more information, you can go to www.fhwa.dot.gov/asset/ and there's a link there that will take you directly to the pooled fund website where your state DOT, MPO, transit agency can register to become a member. In general, it's sort of a 3-year or 3-conference commitment. Anyway, so there's more information there. And also the upcoming 11th National Transportation Asset Management Conference is going to be taking place July 9th through the 12th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you are somebody who has an idea for an abstract, a presentation, paper topic, poster session, those abstracts were due yesterday, but I do know somebody, and if you have a really good idea and you want to sort of get it to us, later on this week, we can try to get that in for a consideration. You can download under the handouts feature of the GoToWebinar service. There's a flyer, a PDF flyer that you can download that has all the information about submitting your abstract. So again, if that interests you, please take advantage of that. So finally, some phone logistics. As I said, throughout today's webinar, the audience is going to be muted by default, and only the presenters will be audible. Just as a reminder to the presenters, be sure to use your phone's mute button to unmute their phones in order to be heard. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve Gay from FHWA to make a few remarks as well. So, Steve, all yours.
Thanks there, Matt. Good afternoon or good morning to those up in the West. Happy you could join us today. I'm Steve Gay, leader of Federal Highway's Asset Management Team. Federal Highway Administration, in cooperation with the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, and also the TAM Expert Task Group, is very pleased to sponsor this webinar series. We feel it's a great way to bring people together around a series of important topics and connect with the asset management community. We have 3 excellent presentations on the agenda, so I'm just going to say a few words of introduction. With this webinar, Transportation Asset Management and Risk Management, we reached our 17th webinar in a series, when we returned to a topic that we first covered back in July of 2014. I know through the years now we've had a number of webinars on this issue of asset management and risk, and I'm really excited to say that, even thinking back to the national conference we had in Miami, we were still having questions like, what is risk? What am I to do with it? I think you have presentations today that are going to be very proactive. People are very active in risk. It's going to really, you're going to be able to really capture how it applies to asset management in the application and the implementation of it in the DOTs. Today's webinar will complement what we've talked about in previous webinars, and also the series of 5 publications that Federal Highways developed over a year ago that you can find on the FHWA Asset Management website. Instead of giving you the web address, I just say Google FHWA Asset Management. It'll take it to you. You see a document on risk. You will also find on that website, we have a couple publications that we posted recently on asset management financial plans. Others also will be developed in the near future. The goal in developing these asset management financial plan documents was similar to that of the risk management, explaining what it is for people to understand what it is and how it can be implemented and what it can do and why it is important. Also, just adding to what Matt said, Asset Management National Conference Pooled Fund, you can find it from the same Federal Highway Asset Management website, and there's further information there as far as, how to join the pooled fund, etc. Yesterday, I sent an email to Federal Highway Division offices and state DOTs to the asset management contacts concerning that pooled fund effort. Finally, I just want to say, happy you're able to join us in today's webinar, and I'm going to hand it over to Yana Park of Spy Pond Partners to give an overview of today's webinar, review today's agenda, and introduce our speakers. One last thing. It looks like there are some opportunities for our states, others to have the NHI asset management training courses presented in their states. So don't hesitate to ask to have the course presented. If funding is an issue, don't hesitate to contact me. Yana, I pass it to you.
Thanks, Steve. So for this webinar, our primary learning objectives are building working knowledge of key concepts and definitions relevant to risk and risk management, understanding specific applications of risk and risk management to TAM programs and plans, and beginning to apply this knowledge in order to answer questions like, how can agencies apply risk management to the management of infrastructure assets? What benefits can states expect by addressing risk management in their TAM programs? And what are the key lessons learned for agencies seeking to integrate risk management as part of their TAM programs? And as always, the purpose of these webinars is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge. And really for all of you, if you have questions, please add them to the question queue. For the agenda today, we started off by hearing from Matt and Steve I will introduce each of our speakers before each presentation, but in brief, our first presentation, we'll hear from Washington State DOT with a presentation from John Milton. Next, we'll hear from Colorado with a presentation from Heather Paddock, and also Amy Flannery from Applied Engineering Management, and Randy Jensen from Federal Highways Colorado office. And for our final presentation, we'll hear from Martin Gordon of Opus International Consultants, and we'll have Q&A at the end. So again, please just add your comments and questions to the webinar Q&A feature throughout the presentations, and we'll respond to each of them in the order they were asked. One final note to our presenters: in order to keep things moving on schedule, I'll chime in to remind you when you have 5 minutes remaining in your allotted time. So our first presentation today is from John Milton. John's the Director of Enterprise Risk and Safety Management at Washington State Department of Transportation. He's their Chief Risk Officer. In this role, he's responsible for identification, assessment, and mitigation of risks, and leads highway safety assessment, analysis, and policy activities. John's going to share with us a presentation he delivered at the Peer Exchange on asset management and risk management. John.
Thank you, Anna. Let me go ahead and start by giving you an idea of what's happening with WSDOT. We just received a $16 billion increase in our budget money. What that did for us was a great deal of bringing in a number of different new projects. Challenge for us in Washington State, though, was that money did not come along with enough money to deal with the assets effectively or efficiently for our department. So we're going to move on to the next slide. So what I'd like to do is kind of set the stage for the issues that we face within DOT, both from a risk management side as well as a safety side, and then give you a discussion about rethinking why we light and some of the challenges that we felt in WSDOT that we needed to cover as we move forward, mostly from an asset perspective, but really being able to blend kind of the risk issues that we see on an everyday basis with the assets that we face, and making it work for everybody in the department, both from a safety side, an asset side, and a risk side. Then get into a discussion about LED adaptive lighting pilot project that we did, and then what we're moving forward with in our department. So as we go into this next slide, I wanted to introduce the WSDOT's perspective on asset management and risk management, how things work together. Some of you have probably seen this slide, but maybe in a little bit different form, in which it looks like a triangle. But in our case, we went ahead and modified it a little bit to fit our specific case. We begin with the idea that we want to carry out and identify our strategic goals and objectives in our department. So clearly understand what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it, because it sets the basis and the baseline for how we do business. What's important for us as well is performance management, not just from the perspective of evaluating and identifying how assets are performing, but making it understandable to everybody, but how you set performance levels and performance goals has an impact essentially throughout the department. And that impact is often not necessarily understood well in terms of how you modify your assets. So the idea would be, for instance, you set a mobility level of service A for your system. Do you have the assets in place? And if you don't have the assets in place, what are the gaps that you need to fill to be able to provide that necessary level of service? From a safety perspective, that might be lighting, and that's part of the thing that we're going to be talking about. Lighting, we want to reduce fatal and serious to zero crashes, but we in the department are essentially facing a significant budget shortfall. So the question for us then is, how do you balance that budget shortfall against your asset needs and your performance level of services that you set to achieve your strategic goals? So you can see how all this works together. What comes down to many times is, how are you going to balance the risk that you have with those assets and achieving those strategic objectives? So you have to take money, for instance, from your program in safety because your assets, let's say in pavement, you don't have enough money to provide for that lowest life cycle cost, that may mean that safety is going to take an impact in some way or somehow. And to be able to address that takes risk discussions and risk management overall. What you see off to the left here as well is the practical design and modal integration. For our department, we're focusing on practical design, that is, coming up with targeted solutions for targeted issues rather than doing the broad-based standards application that maybe some other agencies might be doing. That is a risk-based strategy, for instance. We also want to have a modally integrated system, so part of our decision-making is how do you get there to achieve the acceptable performance at whatever level you might be looking at. Next slide. So now as we move into making the modifications to achieve your strategic objectives, one of the things that we found is that often when you made those modifications, you didn't make the modifications necessary within scoping the pre-design or project design and construction, or throughout that outer circle. Essentially, the elements for carrying out your philosophy weren't developed into your strategies in terms of your manuals, your directions, and how you did things within the department. And when that occurred, essentially, you had a breakdown between what you were intending to achieve and how you were carrying it out, and so therefore you weren't either effective or efficient. And that's what we found in the department. So we worked very, very hard as we go through any asset management, risk management triangle discussion, that we think of it in terms of how then throughout the department are we going to implement this, and we want to make sure that it goes throughout. And that's what this slide shows us. Next slide. Now, as we move through this, I like showing this slide not necessarily because it's one of the busiest slides you've ever seen, but one of the things that I want to show on this is that in terms of what we do, we also have activities that are associated with each one of the specific areas. And as you manage and deal with the risk issues, you need to also understand that there are activities that are associated that need to be checked and balanced. All these things work together, and that's the whole emphasis of what this slide is. Failure to understand that if you don't do evaluating benefits and trade-offs and scoping of projects properly, from both a risk and asset management perspective, all these things could be out of function at any one thing. They're all interlinked and they're all working together. Next slide. So I'm going to go ahead and set the stage for one of the issues that we face. Next slide, please. So the nature of the business is changing at WSDOT. We're transitioning from a capital capacity-based project philosophy to more of an operating and maintaining the system. So what that means for us is that in the past we were able to build a lot of asset capacity or build new facilities. None of that's really happening in this sense anymore for our department. We're also focused on multimodal context-based solutions. For what that means to us is that the assets and the assets that we maintain and operate are going to change. And those assets may be in the past lanes or guardrail. In the future, they may include issues like trees or benches and those kind of things. And we need to be able to deal with those things in an effective manner. We're using targeted strategies to address the performance of the asset. So a lot of times I think we focus far too much on the fact that we have a deteriorating asset, and how do we manage that asset over time is an issue to us. But we also need to recognize that those assets have a performance-based characteristics in how the system and how everything carries out. So guardrail provides for safety. Is that asset providing for safety in the way that we believe it to be? And if not, then is there something we need to do about that? And for us, that was one of the questions that we saw as we moved into this lighting discussion. Was lighting providing what we believed it to be in terms of safety and risk management? And if not, or is there something we needed to do? And we also developed an executive order to help us do that. And from our state, that's really important how we do that sort of development, because we have a lot of issues related to tort liability. Tort liability being a very important thing to us. When we go through any modification, we do it in a way with our attorneys, with our risk management, to make sure that we're covering every base that we possibly have. Next slide. Okay, so Washington State, from its own perspective, has a very small system. Essentially, we have 3,100 existing Illumination systems. But you'll recognize that essentially we had 400 systems installed since 2005. And with the $16 billion increase in projects, we're going to have a lot more systems that go out there. We have about 60,000 light fixtures, and you can see the makeup of those light fixtures. This picture of Washington State essentially shows you that most of our lighting systems are in the urban areas, but we have some in the rural areas as well. Next slide. Now, this is a very important aspect. One of the things that I started with a discussion is that our program was dramatically impacted starting about 2008. And what happened in 2008 was a dramatic increase, essentially, in the cost of pavement, concrete, and those types of things. Because we had light item budgets, that meant in our department that there was going to be shortfalls, and the shortfalls would go in a number of different areas if we were to maintain our assets in terms of pavements and bridges to a reasonably safe and reasonably acceptable condition. But that meant for the illumination systems, basically, that we didn't have enough money to be able to provide for those systems adequately, at least the way that we felt was necessary to achieve. So you can see here, $13.95 million kind of annualized cost. But of that 13.95, although a relatively small number, our budget was only $3 million. So you can see here that basically is a need of right around $10 million. And that's a significant shortfall when you think in terms of our department was having difficulty essentially carrying out many of its functions. And you can see here, lighting being one of those. Next slide. Okay, and optimizing assets and challenging assumptions. Next slide. So one of the things that we first did from a safety perspective is really begin to question what really does lighting provide for us. Now, part of this discussion, I'm going to get into questioning assumptions, but I don't want you to go and walk away from this thinking that I don't believe that safety is provided by illumination. Rather, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that our assumptions that it works in all conditions is not necessarily the case. Here we'll start with this discussion. From 1974 to 1995, what we were told and what we believed was that the benefit cost ratio for lighting was pretty significant and one of the top, 26.8%. From that sort of idea, a lot of illumination was put in an increasing amount, essentially because it was believed to always have a high benefit cost ratio from a safety perspective. One of the things that didn't happen, though, is the recognition that when you put in those lighting systems, there are potential trade-offs. For instance, those poles can be hit. Lighting might provide conditions where there's glare and you can't see sufficiently in differing locations. For instance, Washington State has a rainy environment, not high levels of rain, but a lot of drizzle, and that provides a lot of glare. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do is develop a risk-based approach to consider lighting and performance risk and look at our strategic goals and objectives while doing that. In particular, we're a zero fatal and serious injury state. So what we want to be able to do is maximize any investment that we have to return on investment. So we also want to reduce life cycle costs to the extent possible, but not when that reduction can't be covered by some other mitigative action. So for instance, you may delay pavement overlays by putting some other sort of treatment in terms of maintaining it differently, or a BST, although it might return a shorter life cycle, it may be able to provide a benefit to you in terms of when you actually have to go out and put additional pavement out. We're also into sustainable and clean technology. We're working very hard to reduce greenhouse gas emissions And we're trying to also recognize safety analysis and the advancements that we've seen very recently. Next slide. So this led us to a series of questions from a safety perspective, and this is where risk management really becomes. Where should we focus and what should we focus on? So in our department, we've moved essentially from kind of an overlay of addressing all crashes to be really targeted towards what is the contributing circumstances to crashes and what are the specific elements of crash types or whatever that we can focus on to maximize our investment. And then we go back and evaluate our success in just about every single project that we have. Next slide. So what this means for us essentially is to use and maximize the advancements that we've seen recently in terms of safety. So for instance, the Highway Safety Manual gives us the ability where in the past we weren't able to analyze essentially our benefits in terms of what was the potential, what was the likelihood reduction in crashes, to now where we can do that both now and into the future. And the other thing that we've seen that's been very beneficial for us is understanding human factors and how human factors works to be able to focus how we're addressing the human in the field as well as kind of the statistical issues and the engineering that we see commonly. Next slide. So what we looked at doing as well is, so what is the research telling us? Okay, this is really important from our perspective, is that we don't want to go and accept every research paper and everything that's done and told to us as an absolute. We looked at 300 research reports from 1960 to 2014, and we looked at the experimental design, the data sets, the analysis methods, and asked the question, is this information usable today as it was when it was first done in terms of research? For many of you who are in the safety area, for instance, we, from about 2010 forward, have dramatically changed the way we do business. Empirical Bayes, for instance, random parameter models, those may be a little bit foreign to you in terms of what I'm talking about. What it is essentially advanced statistical methods that are helping us understand and determine things differently than we have in the past. Next slide. So as we went through these research projects, we also wanted to question, is the assumption how we do benefit cost analysis and determining essentially what is the benefits of lighting consistent with what benefits really happen when lighting goes in? So what that meant to us is essentially, were we looking at crashes on the fringe periods, for instance, the civil twilight and the morning time, where lighting has very little impact on reduction of crashes. So those times when it's light enough, but not very or extremely light. What we found is that about 45% of the crashes previously considered to have occurred at night were occurring in these fringe periods where there was a little benefit from achieving the light. What that meant then is that we are overestimating essentially the benefits of that lighting in those given locations. And so in many cases, we're installing lighting probably not as effectively as and efficiently as we could have been. Next slide. So what we did in terms of that was we developed a algorithm essentially for Washington State that looks at the time a day we work with NOAA essentially, and we can predict essentially when the civil twilight periods are. Now, in addition, what we also found in the research is that much of the research was kind of an either-or thing. It didn't look at the situations that actually exist in the field. So how was geometry, speed, traffic volume, congestion, pavement markings, access density affecting the lighting and the benefits of lighting at given locations? And to us, that was a major issue. So for instance, is lighting effective on a tangent as it might be on a curve? And you can argue one way or the other, but the point being is that they're probably different, and we wanted to capture that difference. What we also found is that there was a lot of apples and oranges comparison, essentially. So the lighting would go in with other improvements like lane widening, shoulder widening, and when the analysis was done, it would be associated with the lighting being put in and not necessarily the other factors that were addressed during that safety improvement. Next slide.
John, this is your 5-minute alert.
Okay, thank you. So this is what we found from the state review. Essentially, we looked at design manuals across the nation. Next slide. And what we found with that design manual review is that often the philosophy was more light and more uniform light were better. Nighttime congestion is triggered for continuous illumination. High ADT urban areas were assumed to be better. And what we did is we tested each one of these philosophies. Next slide. What we found as we went through these tests, essentially, is that they weren't necessarily correct. So we went ahead and we did our own research using random parameters. What random parameters allow for is models to vary segment by segment. And so we looked at those types of things, and what we found is, in fact, there are differences, and that lighting in some cases is not beneficial, in other cases marginal, in other cases beneficial. And what we're doing essentially is taking that to what we're doing within the Department of Transportation. Next slide. What we also found in our analysis is that we wanted to bring in these geometric factors and roadway lighting factors. So we looked at a number of different issues and areas to be able to do our evaluation. We used 5 years of crash data. Next slide. So we challenged each one of these notions. And next slide. And what we found in challenging these preconceived notions for lighting is that in many cases, each one of these notions were not necessarily correct. And rather than me going through this, is that our assumptions were not correct. And so this is what we're essentially moving towards within the Department of Transportation in Washington State, is to remove lighting in some locations, and in other locations, reduce the amount of lighting that we have. The idea is that if we're more effective in what we're doing, we can place lighting or make other safety improvements. Because anytime that you make an improvement, you're trading off and taking from another location that may have a higher priority. The other thing that we found is about a $750K annual cost for us in terms of lighting poles being hit. Next slide. Okay, and I'll go really quickly through the adaptive project. Essentially, lighting, we looked at one location. This is in the Olympia area. We're going to remove lighting in different areas, and we're also going to put lighting in that we can turn off or reduce at different times of the day. Next slide. So why we did this is because we did a crash analysis, and we found between 11 and essentially 6 in the morning, there were no crashes. And that's pretty important. Why would we light where there is no crashes? We took the lighting out, or we reduced it, and we've seen no real difference. Next slide. Okay, what this shows is that those locations where you see the green, that is lighting that we're removing. We're maintaining lighting at those locations are what we call basic lighting, where we see a continuous on benefit, and the additional lighting turns off at the nighttime areas. Next slide. This is just a view. We also changed lighting type out there for high pressure sodium to LED. You can see the pictures on the right of your screen there to be much better in terms of being able to see and those types of things. Next slide. And here's another area that we did the adaptive lighting. Essentially, you can see all the green lighting coming out. Basic illumination was maintained, where we felt this is a very steep vertical curve as well as a horizontal curve. You can see there that lighting stays on and through the interchange area. Again, focus on where you get the benefit from the asset and not everywhere. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'll go ahead and end with this slide. We are going through an Illumination reform. We're looking at performance-based contracting in the department. We are going to be removing a number of different lighting systems. We're going through that process right now at WSDOT. We've also added some additional research at the department, and we're developing communication and outreach plans for the department as we go and work with our external partners. In the final slide, please. And it's important for us in Washington State to make sure that we have that partnership. And essentially, in doing so, we're working with WSDOT, the Washington State Patrol, and our Traffic Safety Commission, as well as our asset and risk managers, to make sure that the selection and choices that we have work for everybody. And if they don't, we go back and have additional discussions. And we're making modifications as necessary to achieve our goals here. This is our team, and I wanted to thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. And it's back to you, Hannah.
Thanks, John. I think people will appreciate looking at some of the details in the presentation once it's posted, and you can follow up with John with any additional questions. Our next presentation is from Heather Paddock of Colorado Department of Transportation and Amy Flannery of Applied Engineering Management, or AEM. We will also have Randy Jensen from Federal Highways Colorado Division standing by to address your questions during the Q&A. As Flood Recovery Program Engineer for CDOT, Heather manages the over $600 million program for emergency and permanent repairs from Colorado's 2013 flood event. Heather is also CDOT's lead for the Risk and Resiliency pilot program, developed in partnership with Federal Highway and AEM for FHWA Emergency Relief Program. Amy is the Director of Transportation for AEM. She was the Principal Investigator for the Risk and Resilience pilot program for CDOT and Federal Highways. Randy is the Program Delivery Team Leader for Colorado Division of Federal Highway, where he's the Director of a multifunctional team of professionals responsible for the administration of the Federal Aid Highway Program, including emergency relief. Now I'll turn it over to Heather and Amy.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. This is Heather Paddock speaking. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the flood and the disaster that occurred here in the state of Colorado, September of 2013. It primarily hit northern Colorado, but we had close to, as she mentioned before, about $600 million in estimated damage right now. 486 miles of highway was closed. There were 200 bridges and culverts impacted, and a lot of debris removal. Next slide. You know, the disaster was devastating. Colorado was able to respond very quickly, although this was the largest disaster that the state of Colorado has ever seen or had experienced. So it gave an opportunity to join with other partners. So CDOT and CWCB, which is the Colorado Water Conservation Board, had an opportunity to look at these, since all of our transportation assets were impacted by waters. It was an opportunity to really look at what was the impact, what was the causation, and how vulnerable really were our assets. So we did a hydrology study in all of northern Colorado, and this is just a map showing the sort of phases, phase 1 being the red, phase 2 being the yellow, and phase 3 being the blue of what we studied. Next slide. So inside of the ER manual, if for those of you who have experienced an event before, the most common practice is replace in kind. So basically, if your shoulder gets washed out, more than likely you're going to just replace that shoulder in kind. But we wanted to learn a lot from this event. We've had, in one of our canyons, we had a disaster, 100-year storm event, only 40 years ago, and we lost the whole roadway, and again, we lost it in 2013. So we took this opportunity to figure out how to build betterments or resiliency into our infrastructure. We didn't want to just replace in kind. So a couple of things we looked at. We needed to assess the risk of that asset. What was the risk to it from a natural threat? How vulnerable was it? We needed to estimate the consequences. So what was the dollar value that we would lose if we lost that asset? We gave it a criticality score, and we were able to basically analyze various alternatives. Next slide. So just to give you an example of one of the lessons learned, this is sort of a rendering to show you one of our major canyons that we lost about 13 miles of roadway. This is how it was constructed. In a lot of cases, we had the roadway sitting underneath the 100-year floodplain. We had the road sitting on embankment. And so, everywhere where you see that damaged road section, anywhere the roadway was sitting on embankment, we lost it. But where the roadway was sitting on bedrock, we were able to salvage that roadway. So next slide, please. What we were able to do is come up with a couple concepts. This is kind of your typical repair. This would be what engineers typically think about doing. And we did have to do this after the '76 flood in the narrow section of the canyon where we did get the roadway out of the 100-year floodplain, but we built a wall. This obviously, it works, but it's not aesthetically pleasing. It's not really environmentally friendly. It doesn't breed fishermen wanting to get down into the river. So the concept that we came up with was, next slide, please. Really allowing that road and the river to work together. And this was developed in partnership with CWCB. And, so one of the concepts that we're looking at is pushing that roadway over into bedrock, doing some blasting, and then using that rock as an embankment to protect our, our asset. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Amy to talk a little bit more about the R&R process.
Next slide. So as Heather mentioned, CDOT wanted to go back and do something better than had been done in the past, and we're looking for ways to work with Federal Highway to explain the additional investment. For those of you who have gone through an emergency event, there is a need to justify the additional expenditures beyond replace in kind. And so we brought to them a process that we have been using on the water and wastewater sector and have applied it here in Colorado. And I'll get into more details in the next few slides. But the three pieces of information that we provided to Federal Highway and CDOT are a measure of the asset criticality. So what we looked at is within the overall CDOT program, how critical is this asset that was damaged from the 2013 event. We also looked at if CDOT were to consider design improvement, known within the ER program as a betterment, how might that design perform differently in the future as compared to putting back what was there before, which was referred to as restore in kind. And then finally, similarly, a measure of resilience where we compare the current design standard or replace in kind or restore in kind, excuse me, with a design improvement known as a betterment. And I'll walk through each of these. Next slide, please. So working with CDOT and Federal Highway, and within the confines of the ER manual, the emergency release manual, we came up with this methodology to assess the criticality of each damaged asset. It may look familiar to you. Several states have developed similar indices like this, and what we looked at is the roadway classification, the need for access by essential traffic, which is defined within the ER program, route designation, does it provide service to hazmat vehicles or defense routes or evacuation routes, and then what it was the capital cost to replace. And as Heather mentioned, in some of these damaged assets are very expensive assets to replace, difficult to construct within some of the canyons and the corridors that were affected by this event. So we wanted to be able to reflect to a potential future auditor why the decisions were made as they were over the past 2 years. Next slide. So for each damaged asset, we go in and we rank the score of each of the assets in terms of criticality, and then we look at its criticality level in terms of low, moderate, and high. We've also developed an index score, 1, 2, and 3, which actually ties to the way that CDOT typically spends dollars on assets with Federal Highway. For example, in any given year, we were able to find that CDOT typically spends $3 to $1 for their most critical assets as compared to the low volume, least critical assets. And that's how that score was developed. Next slide. So then we get into calculating the risk. And in this case, what we're looking at is how will the asset perform if it's put back the way it is or the way that it was before the flood event, and how might a betterment perform. So we're going to look at what is the vulnerability of the asset to threats that are nearby, what are the anticipated losses or the consequences, and then what is the threat likelihood. And I'm going to walk through each one of these in the next couple slides. Next slide. So typically consequences, if you were to look at other risk-based asset management plans, especially for critical infrastructure, we would look at things like human losses, revenue losses, economic impacts, environmental impacts, potentially political consideration, loss of services, and then also, of course, the asset loss. I highlighted asset loss in the orange color there to let you know that within the ER manual, the way that it was written in the 2013 update, CDOT was only able to consider the asset loss. So when you're talking about comparing the performance of your asset for restore in kind versus a betterment, that's the delta that you're looking at. How much of that asset will be lost under each of those design considerations for the threats that are present? Next slide. Vulnerability is something that you also take into account typically, and some of the factors that affect vulnerability are asset age and condition. Potentially, if you put any countermeasures in place to reduce vulnerability, like riprap or wing walls that might help to protect that asset from a flood event, you'd want to take that into account in your analysis. One of the things that was interesting about this event is the interdependence between on and off system assets that we learned as we walked through this process. And I'll give you an example. Next slide. So here's an example of a local access bridge up in the canyons on US 34. This is located around milepost 73.5. This would be before the event. And it looks pretty unassuming, doesn't look very harmful. But if you move on to the next slide, you can see that that bridge actually caused significant damage to the CDOT facility. So the CDOT facility is the one to the right, and the local access bridge is the one to the left. And you can see that you can't ignore as an agency the interdependence between your assets and those assets that touch or affect your asset's performance. So we want to take that into account as we move forward. Next slide. Going back to our risk equation, so we're going to look at vulnerability, we're going to look at threats. And so threats, you can take any threat into account. You can look at political threats and natural threats if you can quantify them. Our efforts today to focus on natural threats, and you can see some of the risks that can be taken into account. Flooding and wind, earthquakes, avalanche, tornadoes, fire, certainly storm surge and hurricanes. But one of the things here in Colorado we're looking at too is multiple threats, multiple dependent threats. So for example, we had some pretty significant burns in 2013. In those areas, they are anticipating to be more vulnerable to flooding and debris flow for about the next 10 years, where they're going to take to recover that the soils and the plants that are in that area. Next slide. As I mentioned, we also calculated a measure of resilience. This again, going back to that consequences slide, we're only able to look at the assets that are lost in terms of the value of the asset that's lost. This measure of resilience is another way for us to reflect to a potential auditor in the future why this particular asset is important. And it's a way to reflect the vehicles that cannot be serviced because the facility may be closed. We are currently not able to include user costs within our consequences. And so this is another way for us to reflect that to Federal Highway and to CDOT. Next slide. So I'll give you a quick example, and I'm watching the clock simultaneously. I want to make sure we get through all of our slides. But this is back on US 34 where I had showed you the local access bridge previously. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of what this area looks like in terms of the FEMA floodplain. You can see the facility is all over the top of this FEMA floodplain. Next slide. So when we walk through the process, what we're able to provide to CDOT and Federal Highway is an understanding of how their assets will perform if you were to put back what was in place versus the different design alternatives. And the first blue that's up there is sort of the lighter blue is the restore in kind. So we anticipate losses for that facility from a 50-year event, a 100-year event, and certainly a 500 and a greater than a 500-year event. But if you notice the orange and the gray and the yellow bars, which represent the design alternatives that are being considered, they don't actually seem to anticipate any losses until a 500-year event. So what we're able to show to Federal Highway is this reduction in risk that can be achieved by going back in with some different design alternatives. And we take this information along with the cost of the asset, and we generate benefit cost equations and benefit cost factors for CDOT and Federal Highway. Next slide. So the process that we've applied here is referred to as RAMCAP. It was a process that was developed by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And we think it ties very nicely with some of the conceptual models that Federal Highway has put forth for natural threats and climate change, which is on the left, and then the RAMCAP process is on the right on this slide. Next slide. We're also working with CDOT and Federal Highway to tie together the process that we've developed through the ER program to asset management as a whole. So ideally, these two would operate together. You would have your risk-based asset management plan reflect your identified risk, and then if those risks do occur, or if those threats do occur, you could tie your investments back to your risk-based asset management plan to understand those investments and how they'll affect your overall system risk. Next slide. And Heather's back up with this one. So just to finish out our discussion, as I mentioned before, there's a $600 million disaster, and that was just FHWA eligible assets. Statewide, we probably had $2 billion worth of damage. A lot of housing and FEMA-related assets were impacted. So the governor created a group to basically address it, and really it's because Colorado has seen multiple large fires in the last 5 years and flooding. We want to be able to respond to climate change. We took this as an opportunity to take in some of those lessons learned. And like Amy mentioned, how can we, now there's a need to analyze these multiple threats. There's an asset, a highway down in Colorado Springs that had a fire and continues to see severe flooding in the town of Manitou Springs, even from something as low as a 5 to 10 year event. Next slide.
Heather, this is your 5-minute alert.
Okay, great. So a couple of things this group did is they wanted to put out a 1-year report. They were really emphasizing engagement and community outreach. They developed a Colorado Resiliency Working Group, which I will discuss in a little bit more detail, which also developed the resiliency framework. They had some peer reviews. Resilience Heroes were also, this group is leading the National Disaster Resiliency Challenge application, and as well as the CDBG-DR, which is the Colorado Disaster Grants Disaster Relief, I think is what it is. Next slide, please. So in the Colorado Resiliency Framework, they looked at looking at our resources. They wanted to, reach out to governments, businesses, and nonprofits. They wanted to define what resiliency looks like from a statewide perspective. So they wanted to build it from the grassroots. So it wasn't only what government could do, but what could we do at the local level. So they wanted to empower the locals. They wanted to, support and educate those people, because a lot of times, especially in these canyons, they tend to hit lower income homes. They tend to hit the people that are farthest away from education and internet. They don't have the evacuation routes that the larger cities do. Next slide. So they developed this framework. They've got teams together, all with I would say we sat on as the department, Colorado Department of Transportation. We led the infrastructure group, which includes transportation, green infrastructure, water, wastewater, solid waste, energy, communications, and public facilities. But they were also looking at resiliency from the economic standpoint, how to build that community, like I mentioned, health and social impacts, housing, and then our watersheds and natural resources. And again, I can say that, Colorado CDOT has really engaged in working very closely with our watersheds, and we've
developed a number of, well, not CDOT, but CWCB has developed a number of watershed and stream coalitions, and so working very closely with those groups. Next slide. Yeah, I'm going to just move on through this, but this is just, again, some examples. Yep, and next step. And as Amy mentioned, you know, CDOT is looking for a way to, you know, we have a lot of lessons learned from what we went through this ER process and how to evaluate our assets as it relates to risk to national threats. And we are looking at integrating that into our asset management plan. Next slide. And next slide. And
so I'll address this one real quick. So one of the things that I think a lesson learned that Federal Highway and ASHTO have been interested in is taking some of the lessons learned from the water and wastewater sector. I mentioned the RAMCAP process, which was something by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. We've also have a industry standard within the water wastewater sector that we utilized in this study. And I think there are some at ASHTO and Federal Highway that are interested in developing a similar standard for for the highway sector to help agencies work through their risk-based asset management plans without having to take all of that initiative on by themselves. Next slide. And I think that's it. Thank you.
thank you.
Great. Thank you, Heather and Amy. Our final presentation is from Martin Gordon of Opus International Consultants. Martin is a Senior Vice President with Opus. He's one of Opus's senior asset management advisors and is helping federal, state, and local government clients in multiple countries advance their asset management practices. Martin will discuss leading practices by several agencies and how risk has been used to assess funding adequacy and make trade-offs between service areas and asset groups. Now I'll turn it over to Martin.
Thanks very much. We'll go to the next slide. Very happy to be here to chat today. I'd like to use the next 20 minutes to just talk a little bit about how risk is being used to make funding decisions, I guess, at a funding allocation level for an organization. We'll talk a little bit about that decision-making process and just to set some context. We'll talk about how that idea of incorporating risk has evolved, and part of that discussion will involve a few agencies that are kind of leading the charge in that regard. And then I'll focus largely on how they are applying risk for funding allocation decisions when they're trying to figure out their limited budgets, where they should be allocating it across a portfolio of infrastructure. Next slide. So I think I have a bit of a delay. So risk is, before I get going, for context of why I'm having this conversation with you today, one of the questions, or one of the requests was, let's talk a little bit about what risk is, or could you talk about what risk practices are in other jurisdictions? I'm myself from Canada, and on this slide I'm just highlighting 4 areas that our risk is commonly used. I think project risk management is where most agencies have, and I think the experience that is in other jurisdictions aligns with the folks here in the United States, where you're trying to identify how to deliver the project on time, on budget, and safely. Risk registers, agencies many agencies have gone down the path of establishing what are the key risks to their organization or their service delivery, identifying what those are, putting them in the register, and understanding how they might mitigate those risks. And that tended to focus not directly integrated into the decision-making process, but just try and address those risks specifically on a project basis. Criticality assessments, a lot of agencies understand the road network or water network, which are more important than others. And that sort of risk application is focused on service delivery. And the last one that a lot of agencies are using now in alternative service delivery contract models, where P3 projects are allocating risk to the private sector, where it's best appropriated over to the third party in order to manage that risk. So those 4 areas are certainly where you would find risk most often focused in agencies in municipalities and state and province DOTs and other jurisdictions. I want to focus on how we incorporate, or how some agencies are incorporating risk in how they're allocating how much funds and how they're kind of prioritizing across asset or service area groups and using risk to do that. So there's a number of decisions that you make as an agency on how to allocate funds, and that might include, so I'm not sure if the next slide has come up, I've got a bit of a delay. So the investment decisions that an agency makes is related to whether they are investing in existing assets in terms of rehabilitation and renewal, or whether they should be allocating funds to new infrastructure, whether that means a bypass or new treatment facility, adding new capacity to the network. And it's important to recognize agencies often realize that the decision between adding a new asset to your portfolio or eliminating an asset, so for example, you may have a couple bridges, one having replaced or paralleled another, or actually eliminate some of your link in order to minimize or reduce the asset in your portfolio in order to save some money. But the decision about eliminating assets or adding new assets is different as opposed to the decision process that you follow in order to decide how much funds to allocate for rehab or renewal. Rehab and renewal, you've already decided that this is the road network that you're going to have to maintain, and so you're trying to deliver that at least life cycle cost, minimizing investment in order to deliver on those services. Adding new assets or eliminating assets, really the decision is, does this best align this project or this investment align with the goals and objectives of our organization? So if we move to the next slide, an example of that, so some work was done by the Department of Transportation in New Brunswick, which is on the east coast of Canada. And it started off where the state agency, the DOT, was having trouble convincing their elected officials that they should be investing in infrastructure. And so the agency started off with the strategy map that was established by the politicians, saying, here's what the priorities are for the government. And you can see that there's 3 themes there: stronger economy, enhanced quality of life, and living within our means. And so there's a number of other things that you can see within that strategy map that highlight stakeholders' priorities. And the department realized that if they were going to try and get approval for project funding, it was best to try and articulate how well those projects aligned to those strategies and those priorities of government. Next slide. And so the methodology that was developed was a multi-criteria analysis that aligned to that strategy map. So for each of those things that you saw in the strategy map that was just shown, they developed a framework where there was a material or a specific objective way to measure how well a project or an investment aligned with that strategy. And if you read the literature in this area, when you're trying to make decisions, capital decisions for new infrastructure or for removing infrastructure, the literature often talks about triple bottom line or quadruple bottom line. It's certainly best practice in most jurisdictions. And so DTI, the Department of Transportation in New Brunswick, not only manages the road network, but they manage all of the buildings that house the public sector as well as other infrastructure owned by government. And so they have to try and trade off between the investment into a road versus an investment into buildings or other infrastructure that are delivering different services for the province. And so you can see in the example table that the quadruple bottom line, sometimes triple bottom line, so it's economic, environmental, or social, but if it's quadruple, some agencies decide to separate cultural aspects of the decision out of social. But the criteria that were defined align directly to that strategy map you saw in the previous slide, and the indicators that were developed are objectively measured, so they're quantifiable. And the weightings for each of those indicators are associated with the priorities of government at the time. The reason I'm showing this to you is that it fed into the idea that we might be able, if we were trying to incorporate risk, that there's a way to link the consequence of risk to the implication of the asset contribution to the goals and objectives of the organization. This was directly using that idea in order to evaluate new infrastructure. Next slide. So to give you an example, another example of agencies that when we kind of did the scan, the city of Edmonton is a municipality in Alberta, and they as well recognize the difference between investing, the decision-making process for new infrastructure, which they term as growth decisions for investments for growth, versus investments for renewal, where you're making decisions on investing in existing assets in order to deliver a new service level. You can see the growth table that has their kind of criteria that were similar to the New Brunswick example I just showed you. And while they haven't divided it into triple bottom line or quadruple bottom line, they recognize that to evaluate a project, you have to evaluate it relative to the goals and objectives of the city or the agency. The renewal investments is what the bottom half of the slide is reflecting, is a risk-based system, and they use an optimization tool, piece of software, that they evaluate different investment scenarios for the road network, as an example. They do the same for other asset groups. And they evaluate, and they use as a proxy, you can see in the table, it's quite small, but it's percent D and F. So they use condition, the percent of the portfolio that is in a poor or very poor condition, as a proxy for the riskiness of the decision and the investment profile. So the orange line is what they're recommending, and the blue and the reddish or pinkish line is a reduced funding level and therefore a higher risk outcome over the long term. So the point of this example is that this agency uses, they call it their risk information management system, where they are utilizing a risk proxy to evaluate their investment decision. And they're also recognizing that in order to evaluate investment, that has to be somehow aligned with goals and objectives of the organization, like their growth projects. Next slide, please. So when agencies are making these renewal decisions, let's just focus on that for a moment. Many of us have a lot of tools at our disposal. So pavement management systems are often used, and they use a lot of analytics to kind of come up with how much and how to allocate those investments. So for example, there'd be a number of treatment types considered. So for roads, you might say, how much money should I be investing across the portfolio in crack sealing, patch repair, mill and fill, overlay, and complete reconstruction, and in what proportion? Should those funding allocations be in order for me to have least life cycle costs across the portfolio of road network? And a lot of tools that are available in terms of optimization today, you can hold budget and say, okay, if I hold today's budget, what does that mean over the long term in terms of condition? Or you can hold condition and say, okay, I don't want the network to reduce any, hold its current condition, and what investment do we have to do over the long term in order to do that? Or if you don't like your current condition, you might say, I'd like to have a higher condition state over time. What investment profile should that be, and in what funding levels for those different treatment types? And so many organizations have tools like this, and the thought was, as the idea evolved, why can't we use risk as one of those target objective functions for those same tools that exist within the marketplace now? So if we move on to the next slide, there's a couple slides here just giving that example. I don't think I need to dwell on this. I think most people have a experience where you have tools that kind of show a total expenditure or an investment scenario, which is the upper graph. The lower graph is discounted. So, the tool is saying you're making the decisions on discounted investment over time because time value money is important, and the total expenditure is the budgeted amount for the organization. Next slide, please. And those tools that are, pavement management systems, bridge management systems that many of us have, might provide you with outputs that can forecast the implications of different investment scenarios or different objective functions. So in this case, the road network is divided into different functional class, and you can see the condition varying with green being good and all the way down to pink being bad. Here's what the condition state is going to look like over time. So we have these tools available to evaluate different investment scenarios, and if we could incorporate risk into that, so the idea evolved, maybe we could use that as a mechanism for us to be allocating funds across the portfolio within an asset group or even across different asset classes. Next slide. So I have my bit of delay. So I'm not going to focus too much on this slide. In the interest of time, I think we all know or are familiar on the call that risk, the common risk equation is likelihood and consequence, and you can see the heat diagram there. But when risk is done by many agencies, it's often focused on events, either natural events or natural disasters, and rather than the risk associated with the service itself. And and is often, because it's the easiest and it's kind of the first step, it's assessed in terms of financial impact or other metric rather than the importance of the service to the organization's goals and objectives. And so, next slide, please. When we looked around and said, well, are others doing this? The evolution of the idea was the consequence then is not just the failure event in terms of what does that cost. It is instead the importance of the asset itself, or the asset class, to the agency goals. And the failure of that service delivery then is represented by that level of importance. And quadruple bottom line is can be used as the assessment of the importance of that asset to represent that consequence in that risk equation, and can be viewed as a form of criticality. And so many agencies have already done this, been down the path to understand what is the relative criticality across the network. And condition, as we saw in Edmonton, can be used as that proxy for likelihood of failure, because the poorer condition the asset class or portfolio is in, or the asset itself, the more likely failure can occur. And then we can target risk levels that can be the objective function for the analytics, as I mentioned. So anyway, we'll move on to the next slide. We looked around and said, is anybody doing that? In fact, a number of agencies are doing that, and I'll just highlight one. The region of Peel is a large municipality in southern Ontario, and they have used risk as kind of an independent check on whether their level of funding is adequate in their service area delivery. So they're responsible as a regional municipality for social housing, a road network, water, wastewater, and recreational facilities, all of which require funding. And they're trying to make decisions on how do we cross-allocate funds in order to deliver those services, and what is the right proportion of allocation. So if you look at the upper diagram of level of service range, you can see that they said, well, we know what our target service level is in this particular area that has an asset portfolio. And we know that if everything fails, there's a failure point service level that is at the other end of the spectrum. And somewhere in between there, we have a current service level where there's a gap of where we want to be as the target. And by doing a similar exercise as I articulated earlier from New Brunswick, they translated the service level into a risk. So the target level of service is represented by residual risk. And that's a new term in the sense that, and it can be articulated such that you might have a target service level and you might just have to accept that there's some residual risk associated with that target service level. If you want zero risk with your service level, it would be way too expensive to make sure there was no risk for service failure. So there's kind of a certain level of acceptance of certain risk level with the target level of service, and then at the other end of the spectrum, there's inherent risk. If everything fails, there's a risk of all things failing. And somewhere in between is where your current risk position is based on your current service level. They may not be aligned, and that's why it's important and valuable to perhaps use this as the objective function rather than a condition state, because you might have a higher risk service or and as a consequence, your actually risk position is different than where your current condition is, or your current service level condition is. It's important to know, so Peel uses that same kind of risk assessment. They don't, they're using it as an independent check to their funding allocation decisions. They're fully funded, so they're not actually using it as a trade-off decision-making tool because they're fully funded. And part of the reason they're fully funded through conversations with them is that it was so powerful for them to be talking to elected officials in terms of the risk of the service delivery failure, that elected officials were much more easy to convince to increase funding for those services, whether it was in social housing, roads, or the other services that they deliver. Next slide, please. So
this is your Martin 5-minute alert.
Okay, great, thank you. So the idea that we then moved on with a number of other clients that we were working with was, okay, if we can figure out a funding envelope apportionment methodology where everyone is, so this may be a municipality that like Peel or Edmonton, where they have a number of services with a number of asset portfolios delivering those services. It might be like New Brunswick Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, who have roads, marine infrastructure, transit infrastructure, buildings that house the public service, and other infrastructure that are infrastructure that's supporting different services that they're responsible as an agency to deliver. If we could evaluate the level of importance of those assets and those services to the goals and objectives of the organization, we might be able to actually assess whether funding needs to be reallocated from one service area or asset group to another in order to balance the optimal level of risk accepted by the organization. And that scenario analysis that we would use, similar to what is done already with our optimization tools, linear programming tools that exist in the marketplace, then we could kind of allocate funding accordingly and then execute an asset management plan for each of those service areas or asset classes and get her done. Next slide, please. So in order to do that, I just add this slide to reinforce that point. If you look at the pyramid, really, if you're on the lowest tier of the pyramid, you have some asset knowledge and a bit of experience, and you kind of react to, we have to kind of invest here because we've had some failures. If you have a little bit more as an agency and you have a better understanding of your inventory, then that enables you to actually make a bit more informed decision of where you might invest your infrastructure dollars. Condition reporting and prioritize allows a bit more prioritization because you know where things are in terms of their service life. And this asset group optimization decision making might be is done by many agencies, so the pavements are easily, you can use the pavement management system to do optimization, or you can use the bridge management system to do optimization, but there's not the cross-asset evaluation of funding allocation. And in order to do that, you have to have either the pink pieces at the top of the pyramid and be doing the portfolio dynamics where, so under the asset dynamic, you can see that you require, inventory, condition, and age models. You need a number of treatment strategies like crack sealing, patch repair, mill and fill, and so on. And then you do condition-based optimization with objectives and constraints. That's how optimization works within an asset portfolio, an asset group. If you're trying to do the cross-asset allocation, you do the same thing. You have 3 of the same green inputs, but now you're using risk because you're evaluating the importance of the service or the importance of the asset classes within the service area relative to the goals and objectives of the organization. And you're using the likelihood and consequence of those assets or asset classes and the service areas that they're delivering, or the services that they're delivering, in order to have that evaluation across your asset portfolio. Next slide, please. And so in order to do that, we had to make a bit of a modification to the ideas that Peel were using for the clients that we're currently working with that are using this concept. And because Peel was fully funded, they didn't actually have to make any of those trade-offs. So now when you're doing these trade-offs within that optimization tool, you not only had to know what your target risk level was or your target service level, but you also had to know your maximum acceptable risk. Because there's going to be, if you're under a constrained model and you don't have enough funds to do everything you'd like to do, and you can't have your target service level in all of your service areas, you're going to have to trade off money from one to the other. And the decision on when to trade a dollar from one asset group to another is where you're trying to maximize the investment of your dollar to reduce risk within a service area or an asset class. And so that maximum acceptable risk is the band in which you're letting the system do its analysis to prioritize where the funds should be allocated in order to get your best return of investment, to have the best risk position for the agency across all of the services that it's delivering, whether that's a transportation agency or a municipality, so that risk exposure is minimized for the agency. Next slide, please. So the example that is on the slide reflects that when you do this, that allows the agency to perhaps compare the relative risk of drinking water to the community and the level of risk that's being accepted by the agency given the current investment levels relative to the roads for the municipality, and the allocation of risk is being traded off between those two asset classes in order to balance the risk that's being accepted by the agency for those service levels. I'll move on to the next slide, just in the interest of time. The slide that's titled Key Consideration. So in order to do this as an agency, there's a number of kind of foundation pieces that you have to have in place, just like you can't use a pavement management system unless you have some fundamental information about your asset. So you can see a number of the formation stones like service levels and governance. What are your goals and objectives as an organization? What is it that you're trying to achieve? What are your priorities as an agency? Condition information, inventory. What treatments are you able to do in order to either reduce or improve condition or reduce risk? And what are the costs of those treatments, and what are the objectives and constraints that you're actually under? Funding constraints can be put into the model as well. So you have to have all those formation stones to have that keystone of optimized decision making. Those tools are already available for many agencies. They just need to be a bit modified in order to be considering the objective function as being risk rather than perhaps a condition state or a given funding level. So let's move on to the next slide. So I guess I know a friend of mine often says that when you're doing a presentation like this, it's almost like you've got the fire hose and you're just kind of blowing a whole lot of information at the audience. So I like just saying, here are the 5 key points that you should be taking away from the message, and happy to take questions or have a discussion afterwards. First one is, don't confuse new and renewal decisions. The decision process that you as an agency are making are using in order to make new decisions about new infrastructure should be different than those that you're making, the process that you're using in order to make renewal decisions. Renewals, you're just trying to minimize your cost in order to deliver what you've already committed to delivering, whereas new infrastructure should be aligned with the goals and objectives of the organization, and should become as a consequence of what money is left over from after you have allocated your renewal commitment. Consequence is hard, likelihood is a bit easier. So most agencies, when they're using these kind of techniques, the likelihood can be proxied by the condition states or the condition of the portfolio. Consequence, you have to figure out how do we assess an asset class or a service class or a service component that the agency is delivering is relative importance under a framework like the MCI I illustrated with New Brunswick, in terms of its alignment and importance for the goals and objectives of the organization. And triple or quadruple bottom line is the way that best practice is for agencies to go. These are complex problems, and so they require powerful solutions and ODM, optimized decision-making tools that many agencies already have are your best tool in order to tackle these sorts of problems and integrate risk into your funding allocation decisions. And you have to build those foundation stones. So have those pieces in place. Many of those formative stones that were in the arch, you already have as an agency. And so it just means that you have to align the pieces a little bit differently in order to incorporate risk to your decision. Next slide. So I think that's everything. And I just wanted to acknowledge a number of agencies that are kind of breaking the path in this area. And you can see John McNaught and Karen Rauscher are other folks on the team that have been working on this with some of our clients. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. That concludes our presentations for today. Thank you to all of our presenters. And now it's time for our Q&A. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature of the webinar toolbar, and I'll take them in the order that you type them in. So let's start with the first one. There is one question so far, and it's, I think, directed at Colorado. How did the $100 million a year in emergency response limitation come into play? Heather or Randy, Amy?
So this is Randy. I'll try to answer that, and then Heather can chime in a little bit. Basically, since this event was so large, Congress actually allocated $450 million from money that was left over from other disasters in the past. So the $100 million ER normal allocation hasn't really hampered us yet. I think we're going to exceed that $450 million. So any amount we need above that 450, we'll have to kind of get in line for the 100 million in the future. Heather, do you have anything to add to that?
I guess not. So actually that's, unless another question comes in, that was the only question that has been asked so far. So let's move on, and the next webinar will be held on December 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we'll have the title and presenters confirmed shortly. You'll soon hear from us. Matt will send out an email on the next 4 webinars on the schedule, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that. So please send us your ideas for webinar topics, and as you know, these are going to be continuing every 2 months for another 2 years. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Yeah, thank you to all the presenters. Enjoyed it.